What kind of secrets could a stone-faced, grumpy old prison guard carry? My grandpa spent decades in the shadows of prison walls, but when he finally opened up, the stories he shared left me questioning everything I thought I knew about him, and the system he served. What were these experiments he mentioned, and why did they seem to haunt him more than anything else? My grandpa was a prison guard, and he told me the horrible things he witnessed there. My grandfather was always kind of a dick. I know that's probably not the most kosher thing to say about a close family member, but I think most people who knew him, including him, would agree. He was a stone-faced man, never showed much emotion, and always had a fuse about as short as the balding gray hair atop his scalp. He wore a seemingly perpetual scowl upon his face, and a narrowed brow that seemed to sneer with that get-the-hell-off-my-lawn energy that only a proud boomer could properly muster. I remember one summer my family went out to visit him and my grandma, only for him to chastise my older sister for gaining a bit of weight. It of course made her cry and quickly devolved into a huge family drama that may never have been fully resolved. In stark contrast, my grandma was the most loving and kind person I've ever known, so when she passed a few years ago, it really struck my whole family hard. The funeral was a sordid affair, with my grandfather remaining distant the entire time and not bothering to say a word on her behalf. The rest of the family gave eulogies and tried commemorating her the best we could, but Grandpa seemed not to notice or care either way. Once the ceremony concluded, most of the guests dispersed from the church. As the attendees thinned, I found myself alone in the pews. Grandpa was seated up at the front, and although I didn't necessarily want to talk with him, I felt as though I should. "Hey, Grandpa. I'm really sorry for your loss." He turned to me, a look of spite etched upon his face. He seemed to take note of my expression and has faltered into a sigh. "Thanks, buddy. Tough day for all of us." He dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief and swallowed hard. In that moment, I saw my grandfather in a way I never had before. He was broken and vulnerable, newly alone in the world and clearly struggling to come to terms with it. I felt for him, and although we've never had the best relationship, I very much wanted to try and be there for him. Grandpa rose from his seat and approached the casket. He put a hand down upon it, speaking softly under his breath. "Don't worry, darling. I'm right behind you." Grandpa and I talked a bit more, and eventually I decided he could use some company for the night. Although he was off-putting as a person, he was family. There was also something I always found interesting about him. There was something about him that always enthralled me. Despite his cold exterior, I knew there was more to him than just mean for mean's sake. Either way, no one should have to mourn alone, and so I decided to join him for dinner. After the ceremony concluded, I left the church and went to the store and picked us up some fresh steaks, golden potatoes, and asparagus. I figured cooking him a good meal was the least I could do, considering the difficult circumstances. My grandparents' old home was considerably more worn and overgrown than last I'd seen it as I pulled my car into the driveway. Of course, it was understandable considering the situation, but the difference was stark. It had been well over a decade since last I'd been out there, and although vaguely familiar, the wear and tear made it seem foreign. Grandpa welcomed me at the front door, and the two of us went into the backyard as he fired up the grill. It was a bit awkward at first, but after a beer or two, we started opening up little more to one another. I told him about my life, fiancé, and work, and he seemed genuinely interested in it. We talked a while as the steaks grilled, but I realize not many are reading this to hear about my fated reunion with my estranged grandfather. This is a horror sub after all, and as such, it's probably best I just cut to the chase. Grandpa worked in prison rehabilitation for the entirety of his career. He began at just 18 years old as a prison guard, and eventually worked his way up to warden, which he presided as up until his retirement several years ago. I asked him which prison he worked for, but he sort of avoided the question. "Boy, that's got to be a tough line of work, huh?" I floated the question out, and he paused to ponder it. He swished the beer in his bottle before shrugging. "You get used to it, like anything I suppose, but it'd be a lie to call it easy. Always got to be on your toes, anticipating things to pop off at any moment. Never know what to expect, really." He told me a few stories he had from his long tenure of corrections. He almost seemed overly eager to talk about them, and it made me realize he probably didn't have anyone else to tell them to. He was a bit of loner after all, and it made me feel for him that his wife, and likely only real human connection in the world, was now gone. The two of us ate our dinner and continued chatting about his work in the prison industry and the miasma of experiences he was subjected to there. He had plenty of lighthearted stuff about co-workers and various interactions with inmates, but his tone seemed hampered. I don't know how to explain it, but it was likely there was something else that bothered him, and I decided to try and coax it out of him. You probably saw some messed up things there too, huh? Grandpa sat back and thought, his pale white beard partially obscuring his disconcerted grimace. He then chuckled and clasped his hands together on his lap. Yeah, you could say that. As I'd hoped, he then delved into a few stories about stabbings, attempted breakouts, and attacks on prison personnel. He had no shortage of rather gruesome events to recall, but of course there was one which dwarfed them all. Then there were the experiments. My interest peaked as soon as he said that. He paused then, his head slowly swiveling on his shoulders. Experiments? Yeah, or clinical trials, I suppose. They can sugarcoat them however they like. But that don't change the reality. Far as I know, they never even published the findings. And I'm not surprised. He was clearly a bit reticent to divulge the details, and I didn't want to push him on it. The admission alone seemed to hang like a weight on his neck, dragging his posture down and his eyes into fog. If there is a God out there, I can understand why we never hear from him. Grandpa said he had been working at the prison for a good 2 decades when these experiments began. By then, he was the lead guard on shift, and essentially second in command to the presiding warden at the time. Grandpa was summoned by the warden one day for an impromptu meeting, or so he thought. As he entered the room, he found the warden with 2 other men in his office. The 2 men were well-dressed in blue suede suits with polished black wingtips. Both had neatly combed hair and beards with stark blue eyes. The warden introduced them to Grandpa as Mr. Smith and Mr. Johnson, but did not elaborate who they were or what organization they worked for. No doubt it was some government branch, but I never got confirmation either way, Grandpa explained. Apparently, the 2 men had already struck a deal with the warden, and Grandpa was to be a part of it as well. They explained they were conducting an experiment to test the limits of the human psyche. They explained that all Grandpa would have to do was the same thing he'd been doing for 20 years, guard the cells, and ensure there were no complications with the inmates. The deal came with a substantial financial bonus, one which nearly doubled Grandpa's salary that year. But of course he knew there would be a catch. The things we do for money. He just shook his head solemnly as he said it. These experiments would go on to be known unofficially as the Seclusion Project. The idea was a simple one. Take 5 prisoners and put them into solitary confinement indefinitely. Smith and Johnson's crew would monitor them and conduct research as they saw fit. The 2 men explained it was important research to determine the harmful effects on the human psyche to further understanding of the brain. But Grandpa saw through it. It was cruel, it was inhumane, and by the end it was a crime against humanity. They knew that from the beginning, but they also knew no one would speak on the behalf of those they chose. 5 inmates were chosen for the experiment. The warden claimed they volunteered for a reduced sentence, but Grandpa knew that was a lie. To put it simply, the 5 chosen were among the worst offenders currently imprisoned. Prisoner 1 was a middle-aged white male who had been convicted of multiple counts of aggravated sexual assault against minors. He'd been sentenced to 57 years and had served just 4 up to that point. Prisoner 2 was an elderly white male who had been convicted of the rape, murder, and mutilation of 6 different female sex workers over the span of 9 years. He'd been given 3 life sentences and was the longest currently incarcerated inmate in the entire prison. Prisoner 3 was a black male responsible for the stabbing murder of an elderly couple and their 7-year-old grandson as a result of a home invasion. He'd been sentenced to capital punishment and had been on death row for almost 5 years awaiting his fate. Prisoner 4 was a middle-aged Hispanic male who had once served as a hitman for a notorious drug gang. He'd been convicted of executing 8 people and disposing of their remains during his tenure, though many believe his body count was much higher. Prisoner 5 was actually the only inmate that wasn't currently incarcerated at my grandpa's prison. He was brought in from another prison, but Grandpa was never able to get a hold of his file to see where he was transferred from, or what he was actually in for. He described the guy as a young, very skinny white male with long black hair and evil eyes. Grandpa said he locked eyes with the guy once, and only once, viscerally rattled by the experience. The cells in which the participants were to be housed were in an isolated wing of the prison deep underground. Each cell had to be retrofitted with a number of augmentations which were completed by Smith and Johnson's crew. It took them almost a full year to do it, but once they were done, the cells were unlike any others, entirely soundproof from the inside and entirely devoid of light. Cameras equipped with both infrared and night vision lens were installed upon the ceiling of each cell to monitor the occupants 24/7. Finally, the renovations were completed and the cells were ready to fulfill their grim purpose. One by one, Grandpa and his team escorted the men into each of the cells. Most went quietly without a word spoken. Grandpa theorized that the men were given promises of commuting their sentences, which helped ensure their compliance, but this was never confirmed. Inmate 3 talked non-stop throughout the trek to the cell, asking all manner of questions about a variety of things. Grandpa and his men just remained silent. Inmate 5 was mostly silent during the transport as well, his long dark hair covering his face the entire way. At several points, Grandpa swore he heard the guy giggle under his breath. He said it sounded like a kid's laugh, and that obviously didn't make him feel any better. The guy went into his cell without protest, and as his door shut, the trials had officially begun. All the lights in the block were extinguished, and the outer soundproof doors were shut. Each cell was separated far from one another to prevent the inmates from being able to communicate verbally. From there, all the supervising team had to do was wait and watch. Grandpa simply went back to his duties then, checking in periodically on Smith and Johnson's team but never venturing into the cell block. The inmates were to have no contact with the outside world whatsoever, and no exposure to light of any kind. Small slots in the walls were used to distribute food and water, and the inmates were well fed with good hearty meals, unlike the majority of the other inmates in the prison. Grandpa continually emphasized how uncomfortable he was with the whole thing, even from the get-go. "Why didn't you say anything?" I bit my tongue as the words left my lips, worried I would offend him. Grandpa just sighed. His shoulders slumped as his lips pursed. "It's hard to speak on behalf of those you detest, even if you know they are being wronged." There was a profound truth to his words, and it made me take pause as he added another thought. "It's not an acceptable excuse, but..." He just trailed off there, shaking his head and sighing. After just a few days of seclusion, the inmates were already struggling quite a lot. Inmate 2 had been crying periodically, while 3 showed signs of severe paranoia. The other 3 remained mostly silent. 5 was the most unnerving, however, sitting almost entirely motionless for the entire day aside from sleeping. 4 tried to keep himself busy doing calisthenics like push-ups and sit-ups, while 1 mostly just laid around in various positions, slipping in and out of consciousness. On the eve of day 5, inmate 2 had slammed his head into the side of the cell and began bleeding from his nose and mouth. After the impact, he fell and convulsed for several seconds on the ground as blood dripped from him. He fell still, and my grandpa anticipated them conducting a medical intervention, but they never did. They just continued to monitor as inmate 2 was left to his own devices. Later that same day, and inmate 3 suddenly screamed. He began scrambling around his cell blind, slamming into walls and babbling incoherently. "There's something in here, man. Let me out!" He shouted the words as tears poured from his eyes. He continued freaking out for a few more minutes until tiring himself out. He then collapsed onto the ground, panting heavily, staring upward to the top of the cell. He couldn't have seen it, but my grandpa swears he was staring directly into the feed of the camera. Inmate 1 began having conversations with himself, apparently acting as both parties on either side of the conversation. The things he discussed with himself began as asinine, even comical at times, but they quickly took a disturbing turn. He seemingly role-played conversations between a young boy and his father, and the things discussed turned Grandpa's stomach. He wouldn't repeat or even hint at them. but considering why inmate 1 was imprisoned in the first place, I can probably fill in the blanks. Inmate 1 then broke down sobbing quietly as he held himself in the fetal position. My grandpa says this was the moment that really made him actually feel something for the inmates and question what the hell he'd signed up for. These men did horrible things, ain't no changing that. But even so, you come to realize how everyone has a story. Were they born monsters or were they made monsters? I won't pretend to understand how these things work, but what I do understand, from one human being to another, is the suffering of life. Things only got worse from there, and outbursts of screaming and sobbing became commonplace amongst all participants minus inmate 5. Alone in the silent darkness, they had nothing but their own minds to keep them company, and that company was clearly not bringing much comfort. Inmate 4 would often pantomime holding a gun and seemingly acting out shootouts and conflicts in his cell. His breathing would increase and he'd be moving and ducking around the cell as though he were trying to avoid getting shot. Inmate 3 would shuffle around his cell, flinching randomly and at times collapsing to the ground as though someone had struck him. Inmate 2's condition had continued to deteriorate. Clearly, his head wound trauma had likely caused brain trauma, and he would regularly suffer seizures and fits of screaming at the top of his lungs. He refused to eat, and the food he was given began to pile up by the cell door. Some of the prison personnel wanted to retrieve him for medical assistance, but Smith and Johnson wouldn't allow it. They were told time and time again that no matter what happens to the inmates, they were not to intervene. By day 9, inmate 2 was dead. He'd been laying motionless face down for nearly a full day when his passing was finally confirmed. As they rewound the footage to try and determine the time of death, they noticed something odd. As soon as inmate 2's chest had stopped moving, inmate 1 suddenly perked up. He then lifted his head and smiled, extending his hand to wave at something as though he were saying goodbye to an old friend. He, of course, had no way of communicating with inmate 2 nor knowing he had passed. It was a weird event, but it was regarded as a simple coincidence. Inmate 1 continued to deteriorate after that, spending most of his time just sitting catatonic in his cell. Inmates 3 and 4 also continued to show signs of severe delusions and paranoia. Inmate 4 would randomly burst into fits of screaming as though he were threatening a rival before reverting to hysteric sobbing as he begged to be let out of the cell. At one point, he punched the wall full force, shattering his fist into a mangled mess of flesh and bone. Contrary to the rest, inmate 5 hardly ever made a peep. He would sit motionless in his cell for hours, hiding his face as he seemed to meditate. Every once in a while, he'd look directly into the camera lens, though, despite not being able to see it. My grandpa said he still gets chills picturing the way the guy smiled and swears something about him was downright evil. Let me ask you a question. Grandpa suddenly interrupted his tale. Behind the smoldering campfire, I spied him staring down at his boots, swirling his whiskey in his glass. His eyes then drifted to me, an almost hesitant aura in his eyes. Is it evil to do evil things to evil people? I thought about it a moment, a cold chill slithering down my spine as I anticipated where this topic was headed. I wish I could say I came up with some profound response, but I didn't, and still don't have one. In the end, I just shrugged and took a swig of my lager. Grandpa's expression then shifted as though he were at a similar stalemate himself. I fear the day the world finds an answer to that question. Eventually, the team conducting the trial brought medical supplies to inmate 4. As soon as the guard slid open the access port at the bottom of the door, inmate 4 lunged for it. "Let me out, man, please. You gotta let me out. I'll do anything." He tried grabbing at the guard through the port, but the guard managed to retreat away. He then slammed his baton on the man's hands until he recoiled back inside. The guard flung the tray of food along with the medical supplies in after him and slid the port shut. Inmate 4 began to sob hysterically, switching between bargaining and yelling threats for nearly half an hour. He eventually seemed to wear himself out and collapsed in a heap in his cell, but not before muttering one final chilling phrase: "Please don't let it get me." Grandpa ended up working late that night, and just before he clocked out was when it happened. One of the other guards frantically called him to the monitor station. On the feed, Grandpa saw inmate 4 flailing around desperately and screaming. He said it seemed like something was attacking him, but of course, there was nothing else in there. By this point, the two station guards had already witnessed so many disturbing events that they wanted to intervene and help the guy, but Grandpa overruled them. His chest seemed to deflate as he admitted that. But in the end, all the three of them did was watch. Inmate 4 continued to wrestle around for several long minutes until finally falling flat on his back. He then began to grasp for his neck and appeared as though he believed someone was straddling his chest and choking him. He began to gurgle and cough, flailing desperately as his eyes bulged from their sockets. In under a minute, he let out a soft gasp as the strength drained from his body and he fell still, never to move again. Once again, the moment Inmate 4 fell still, Inmate 1 perked up. Just as before, he then smiled and waved while staring in the direction of Inmate 4's cell, despite not knowing where he was housed or even that he was there to begin with. Inmate 5 then suddenly perked up from his fetal position. His neck craned backwards and head angled upwards, but his face seemed entirely devoid of emotion. "Please don't let it get me." He repeated the final words of Inmate 4 in a whisper. He, like Inmate 1, had no way of knowing nor hearing Inmate 4, and yet somehow repeated the exact same phrase. As the words left his mouth, his lips curled into a wide, almost inhuman smile. Grandpa described it as the look worn only by the most deranged of lunatics. Inmate 5 then erupted into a bellowing laugh, which caused everyone in the observatory room to flinch. Grandpa said he was damn near scream-laughing at the top of his lungs as his eyes seemed to bulge out of their sockets. After a good full minute, he finally seemed to quiet as his calamitous laugh quieted to a hushed giggle. "Please don't let it get me." He then turned and once again glared directly into the hidden camera lens in his cell. Grandpa described that moment as feeling like he was staring into the eyes of the devil himself. He'd seen enough for that night, but before leaving, Smith caught up with Grandpa as he was about to head out. He first made casual conversation with him, before asking him a series of strange questions. "You ever see anything weird around here? How are you sleeping lately? You guys get a lot of inspections in this facility?" Grandpa didn't say much in response, just shrugging off most of the questions. Smith tried to code his inquiries in a nonchalant manner, but Grandpa knew better. There was no way of hiding the dread which dripped from his every word, for Grandpa felt it too. The following morning, Grandpa got a call as he was preparing himself for his shift. The call was from a frantic co-worker telling him they needed him there as soon as possible, but didn't clarify what had happened. Grandpa arrived at the prison not long after, and was quickly ushered into the camera room. There he noticed that Inmate 5's cell was suddenly empty. Grandpa asked where Inmate 5 was, and the solemn guards just guided his attention to the monitors. They replayed the recording from the previous night at just before 3 a.m. Grandpa watched mystified as 1 second Inmate 5 was seen sitting idle before suddenly just vanishing. There was no split in the feed, no movement of any kind. Just 1 second he was there, and the next he was gone. Grandpa stared at the other two guards, but neither of them had any explanation for what had just happened. One of them suggested going into the cell to check it out firsthand, but none of them were eager to do that. Instead, they waited around spitballing theories until Johnson and Smith arrived along with the warden. Grandpa then informed them what had happened and showed them the video from Inmate 5's cell the previous night. Grandpa said that was the first and only time he ever saw any emotion on their faces, and their reaction clearly conveyed their fear. "Lock the prison down now. No one comes in or goes out," Johnson commanded, and the befuddled warden sounded the alarm. Every single prisoner in the entire complex was returned to their cells. Grandpa and the other guards spent the next 12 hours combing every square inch of the prison. Despite their best efforts, not a single trace of Inmate 5 was found. The search was eventually extended beyond the prison walls, but once again the attempt proved futile. Eventually, Smith and Johnson ventured in to search the seclusion cell block themselves. By this point, only Inmates 1 and 3 were still alive in their cells. Neither of them reacted as the men entered the block. Inmate 1 continued, just rocking back and forth, mumbling, while Inmate 3 appeared to be asleep. Smith and Johnson were in there for nearly an hour before returning defeated and stupefied. They didn't say much to the others, and by that point the entire staff was exhausted from the day's events. Grandpa and his crew were dismissed as the night crew took over. Grandpa said he had some of the worst nightmares of his life that night and barely slept a wink despite being exhausted. When he returned to work the following day, he found the other members of his crew looking much the same. They were all summoned into the meeting room with the warden as they awaited their instructions. The warden then informed them that the experiment had been discontinued. The only surviving members of inmate 1 and 3 were to be returned to general population. Grandpa protested that decision, but was overruled. It turns out Grandpa was right to be wary, as neither inmate lasted long when back in the prison. Inmate 3 began behaving like a cornered animal, showing signs of paranoia and aggression. He got in multiple fights with other inmates, until one scuffle ended with him getting his head slammed into a bed. He ended up dying from severe cranial hemorrhage not long after. Inmate 1 was much more composed, but no less traumatized. He just kept to himself, refusing to eat and isolating himself from everyone. After about a week of his self-imposed starvation, Grandpa's team prepared to intervene. They found him dead in his cell the following morning. His body was taken for autopsy, but the coroner could not determine a cause of death. Apparently, the fallout from this event caused the former warden of the prison to step down. My grandfather was named the new warden shortly thereafter, but a lot of the other guards ended up leaving as well. For a while, the management was worried about a potential legal investigation, but as time went on, there was nothing. They never heard from Smith or Johnson again, and in time, people forgot. But Grandpa never did. He polished off the remainder of his beer and clasped his hands before him as he concluded his story. The campfire had been reduced to smoldering coals by then, and Grandpa's once serious demeanor appeared suddenly much more crestfallen. We all do things we're not proud of, you know. We all make decisions for what we think is the best option, but sometimes we're wrong. I did it for the money, no denying it. But why did they do it? Smith and Johnson, whatever their real names were. Why did they do it? His gray eyes drifted to me, as though he expected me to answer. More than likely, he searched for any answer that could be offered, but I hadn't one to give. Did they ever find him? That prisoner that disappeared? Grandpa's head slowly swiveled side to side as his eyes seemed to deflate. As far as I know, he was never seen again. It was in that moment that I almost found myself skeptical. He'd told his story so well that I very nearly believed it. "You're fucking with me." I called him on it, but his face didn't falter an inch. He slowly turned to me with that cold, ironclad stare that he was renowned for. He didn't need to say anything in his defense, for his expression told me his words were true, and they had haunted him for a lifetime. How does that happen? How does someone just vanish into thin air? Grandpa shrugged at the question and massaged the back of his neck. He thought for a moment, then smirked, but refused to make eye contact. "If you can figure that one out, you let me know." He chuckled to himself, then crossed his arms. "There was one report years ago. This young gal was at home alone one night when someone tried to break into her house. Poor thing was scared stiff, and the description she gave of the man she'd seen seemed to match inmate 5. He met my bewildered stare as I hung on every word. So the cops look around but can't find anything. Things calm down. Then about a month later, the same young lady vanishes. Never seen again, never solved." He paused once more, then scoffed as he adjusted his posture. "Of course it's impossible, right? All of it is. That's what I'd say if someone told me, but yet I was there. I seen it." He fell silent once more as the two of us contemplated the prospect. I figured it best to allow him to convey his thoughts, and so I waited until he spoke again. "Maybe it's best we don't know, but there was one detail of that troubling story which really spooked me. There was a message written in blood on the front of her house." He paused and glanced to me, as if waiting for me to conclude the thought. It struck me then, and a cold chill slithered down my spine. "Please don't let it get me," I answered, and Grandpa nodded solemnly. The two of us just fell silent for a while, contemplating the disturbing story before he spoke again. "There's a phrase I've heard before. Maybe you have too. Hurt people hurt people. People that have been traumatized will traumatize others. Maybe that's what these things we call demons are. Trauma that takes on a life or existence of its own. He paused, and I contemplated his words once more. It was a frightening thought, but I haven't the faintest clue how these things work, so maybe he's right. It's the best explanation I can think of. But what do I know? I've screwed up my own life enough that maybe I'm just trying to not hate myself. His eyes seemed to gloss over and his lips trembled. He seemed like he so desperately wished to pour his heart out and for once be vulnerable, but as always, he didn't. Good talk, bud. Don't stay up too late. That was all I got. His last parting words before taking his leave. It was the last conversation we ever had, but his words have been with me ever since. I didn't know what to make of his story, but he sure seemed to put a lot of stock in it. It horrified me knowing what he was a part of. But I suppose I shouldn't be that surprised. I'm sure there's all sorts of nefarious experiments and trials in the past, but that's not really what this account was for. Grandpa was a complicated man who lived a complicated life. I never knew him well, but I am glad I got to know him a little bit. It makes his sour demeanor throughout the years a little less imposing, and sheds some new light on why he was the way he was. I just hope he found some peace before the end. But after what I heard, I'm not sure it worked out that way. Grandpa passed away a few weeks after my grandmother did, so I suppose he was right when he shared those words with her. I heard from my aunt later that he'd been found in his favorite chair, a cup of coffee beside him with a single piece of paper in his lap, etched in a simple handwritten phrase which rattled me to my core. Please don't let it get me. My grandmother tried to drown me as a baby. I now understand why. I'm currently writing this from under a bridge. It's a couple of hours until dawn and the streets are dead silent. I'm fairly sure I'd hear the sirens when they come for me. I'm hoping that means I have time. I am under no false illusions. I know barely any of you will believe me, and I don't blame you. I'm a scientist, a pragmatist. I've always believed in hard evidence, in the tangible and irrefutable. Ghost stories were for children, and superstitions, merely these same stories persisted into adulthood. So I can imagine what it's like to be you, possibly curled up in a bed somewhere in the dark, scrolling through a strange story written by some distant stranger you have no cause to believe. I've been on your side many a time. But if there's a chance, just a chance, that one of you may have experienced something similar, or have minds malleable enough to accept what I previously thought impossible, then I feel it's important I share my story. For context, I have go as far back as my grandmother Sylvia. I don't remember much about her. Most of what I know comes from old photographs and whispered conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. Sylvia grew up in a small, middle-of-butt-fuck-nowhere Bible town called Driftwood, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, and the church bells regulate daily life more reliably than any clock. Her parents, my great-grandparents, were Old Testament types who saw sin lurking behind every corner and liked their early morning coffee with the smell of brimstone. They raised Sylvia to fear God with such intensity that she'd spend hours kneeling on the hardwood floor, praying for forgiveness if she so much as took an extra biscuit from the cupboard. There's an old sepia photograph of her I remember Mum kept around for a while, small and dark-featured, with a gaunt little face and lank, unkempt hair. She wore a strange, oversized robe that I later learned was the standard uniform given to the members of the New Eden community, if it's not immediately apparent from the creepy-ass name. Yes, it's a cult. You might even remember them by the moniker they later adopted, after all the infamy died out. They were pretty notorious in the 1980s when that Venezuelan singer, Solimar Valencia, joined their ranks. You may know them now as the Brides of Christendom. A questionable rebrand, but it worked. You know the ones. They stand outside Targets and Costco's, wearing those robes that look like bohemian bridal gowns, passing out pamphlets and targeting families with any young girls in tow. And that's now, with all the public scrutiny and police investigations. Imagine how bad it was when they were simply known as the New Eden community. A bunch of nutjobs, sure, but harmless and secular and best left alone. This is the world my grandmother grew up in. Now, I'm not sure what happened exactly. though I've done a fair bit of digging since it started, but my grandmother left New Eden when she was roughly 15. She was taken into a halfway house for underaged and disgraced young mothers where she birthed my mother. As far as I'm aware, Sylvia never told my mother who her father was. He must have been a horrible person, because whenever the question was asked, Sylvia would near about lose her mind. She'd get nasty, violent, would force my mother to kneel on sun-baked gravel for the better part of 8 hours whenever she asked the question. And when my mother would hobble back inside, knees bloody and face salty with dried tears, Sylvia would finish off the punishment with 48 hours of enforced starvation. For Sylvia, the more ribs you could see on a person, the more penitent they were. It's no wonder my mother cut ties as soon as she could. She would tell me that Sylvia would wildly pivot between a loving, delicate woman scarred by New Eden to a bitter, abusive tormentor, desperate to pass on some of that same trauma to her own daughter. My mother moved states, got a job, and enrolled in night classes. She worked her ass off and ended up in a junior position at a civil law firm. That's where she met my dad, a paralegal. They fell in love, got married, and soon after Mom got pregnant with me. The pregnancy nearly killed her. It started with seemingly normal symptoms, a persistent low-grade fever that doctors attributed to a mild, chronic infection. She bruised easily, so they pumped her full of vitamins and iron supplements. The tinnitus and heightened sensitivity to smells were written off as typical pregnancy symptoms, but then things started getting weird. My mother developed an overwhelming craving for raw meat. Not just any meat. It had to be fresh, barely touched by refrigeration. My dad would find her in the kitchen at night, standing in the dark, tearing into raw sirloin with her bare hands and teeth. She'd sob afterward, horrified by her own actions, but unable to stop herself. The hunger was all-consuming, primitive. It spooked the hell out of my dad, but he was a first-time father. Pregnancy cravings were a thing, and what the hell did he know? I was strong too strong for a developing fetus. I broke 3 of her ribs as I grew, and the doctors couldn't explain how. But worse than the physical symptoms was the fear. My mother carried around a consuming, endless sense of doom that didn't abate until my birth. She couldn't describe it, couldn't rationalize it, but she was terrified. Not of birth, not of me specifically, but of something else. Something she could sense, but not see. It was during her 3rd trimester that she reached out to Sylvia. I think the fear finally overcame her pride, her justified anger at her mother's abuse. No matter their strained relationship, she wanted her mama. And surprisingly, Sylvia came. I found my mother's diary after she passed, and that's how I learned about Sylvia's brief return to our family's life. According to the entries, Sylvia was different, softer, more present. She doted on my mother, cooked for her, helped prepare the nursery. My mother wrote about hope, about the possibility of healing generational wounds through shared experiences of motherhood. Sylvia was respectful, helpful, an anchor during a stressful time, until she tried to drown me in the bathtub when I was 2 weeks old. My dad found her just in time. He didn't see the knife at first. He was too focused on fishing my tiny body out of the water. Sylvia stabbed him, but the blade caught mostly fabric and just a bit of flesh. She was small, malnourished from years of religious fasting and self-imposed punishment, so my father was able to subdue her while still holding on to me. My mother came running when she heard the commotion, and that's when Sylvia started screaming. The things she screamed haunted my mother, enough that she wrote about them constantly in her journals, etched permanently into ink-stained pages as much as her mind. Sylvia had raved about a curse on the women in our family, about how she hadn't been strong enough to kill my mother when she had the chance, and she wouldn't make that mistake with me. Apparently, she screamed so hard she coughed up blood. She begged my mother to end our line, said each daughter born was like rolling dice. Not all of us would birth daughters, she said. Some of us would birth something else entirely. They took her away in handcuffs, still screeching about darkness and choosing, and something about rooms deep underground where the brides would go. The doctors diagnosed her with religious psychosis, citing her involvement with the New Eden community as the root cause of her break from reality. 3 weeks later, They found her hanging from a bedsheet noose in her room at the psychiatric facility. She left behind a single note for my mother. I tried to save you from being chosen. Now you must save your daughter. End the bloodline before they find her. My parents did their best to give me a normal childhood after that. They never spoke of Sylvia or what happened, though sometimes I'd catch my mother staring at me with this uncertain look in her eyes. But nothing happened. I grew up, went to college, got a degree in biochemistry, and landed a job in pharmaceutical research. I was the very model of rationality and scientific thinking. Then my parents died in a car accident when I was 27. The police said a deer jumped into the road, causing my father to swerve. Their car hit a tree at 60 miles per hour. The officer who called me said they died instantly, but I later read the coroner's report. The impact didn't kill them. The fire did. Witnesses said the car burst into flames before it hit the tree, though the mechanics found nothing wrong with the fuel line or electrical system. I spiraled after their death. Grief does strange things to people, makes them reckless, desperate for connection. That's how I ended up in a bar 3 months after the funeral, drinking whiskey like it was water and going home with a stranger whose face I can barely remember. The pregnancy test came back positive 6 weeks later. The symptoms started immediately, and they were eerily familiar from my mother's diary entries. Like her, I developed an insatiable craving for raw meat. I fought it, knew it had to be bad for the baby. My mind searches for answers in science. Perhaps I had an iron deficiency and needed a protein boost. Maybe there was a genetic component. I held out for almost 2 months before I gave it, and fuck me, it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. I'd find myself standing in my kitchen at 3 a.m., blood dripping down my chin as I devoured raw chicken hearts I'd bought for the dogs. I loved the sound they made, sinew and muscle giving way beneath my teeth. The fever came next, a constant, low-grade burn that no doctor could explain. My skin would bruise at the slightest touch. But there were new symptoms, too. Ones my mother hadn't experienced. I started having dreams. Horrible, vivid dreams of dark, underground rooms where something waited in the shadows. It wasn't a memory, I knew that. But it was real. I knew that too, somehow. Harriet was born on a moonless night in October. The delivery room lights flickered and died just as she crowned, and when she finally emerged, she didn't cry. She just stared at me with eyes that seemed too knowing for a newborn. The nurses said it was normal, that some babies are just quiet. They ran some tests, signed the birth certificate, swaddled her, and gave her back to me. I went home a day later, alone and relieved. It was short-lived. As she grew, it became clear something wasn't right. Harriet never babbled like other babies. She didn't laugh or cry, just watched, always watching. By age 2, she was diagnosed with solar urticaria, an extreme sensitivity to sunlight that kept her indoors during the day. Her skin would blister and burn within seconds of sun exposure, so we became creatures of the night, venturing out only after sunset. The doctors ran test after test, checking for autism, selective mutism, any explanation for her complete lack of verbal communication. Everything came back normal, but I began to wonder. Small paranoid thoughts began to fester in my mind. I saw the way animals reacted to her, the way neighborhood dogs would whimper and hide when we passed, the way birds would fall silent and still when she looked at them. At night, I'd often find her standing at her bedroom window, small hands pressed against the glass, staring out at our moonlit street as if waiting for something, or someone. Sometimes I swore I could hear her whispering, though she'd been nonverbal her entire life. I made a good show of being stern at first, demanding she go to bed. She'd go willingly enough. Oh, she always obedient. But after the 7th or 8th time I caught her standing there, rigid and whispering, I stopped chiding her, stopped searching for her in the night at all. Truth be told, she scared the shit out of me. I'd simply stand in the doorway watching her silently, rehearsed admonishments curdling in my mouth. One time, as if she'd somehow heard my footsteps, she looked back over her shoulder at me. We simply looked at each other for nearly 15 silent minutes. I swear to God, when I turned to walk away, I think she smirked. She turned 5 on a Monday. The brides of Christendom came on the following Tuesday. 2 women in flowing white robes stood on my doorstep, pamphlets in hand. Their skin was pale, their hair so black it seemed to absorb light. Familiar coloring. I saw similar features whenever I stared in the mirror each morning. I remember staring down at that pamphlet, debating with myself. But I'd been living with a strange little child for 5 harrowing years by that point, and I'd recently finished reading all of my mother's journals. I'd read Sylvia's warning. So I mentioned my grandmother had been part of their community once, and their eyes lit up with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Sylvia's granddaughter," one of them breathed, reaching out to touch my hand. "We've been looking for you for so long." I shouldn't have invited them in, but I was desperate for answers about my family history, about Sylvia. They sat primly on my couch, their white robes pooling around them like spilled milk. We talked about mundane things at first, the weather, the neighborhood, their charitable work. They were articulate and warm, speaking passionately about their women's shelters and educational programs. Something about their careful politeness reminded me of funeral directors. Then Harriet wandered into the room. The change was subtle but immediate. One of them stopped mid-sentence, her carefully practiced smile faltering for just a moment. They exchanged a glance that lasted a fraction too long. The younger one leaned forward slightly, hands clasped in her lap so tightly her knuckles bled white. "What a beautiful child," the older one said. "Is she yours?" "Yes." "Biological?" "Why does that matter?" They began asking questions then, each one seemingly innocent, but somehow wrong. Had she always been so quiet? Did she have many friends her age? Was she eating well? Did she sleep through the night? When was her last checkup? When I tried to steer the conversation back to Sylvia, they barely seemed to hear me. Their attention remained fixed on Harriet, who stood silently in the doorway, watching them with her unnaturally still gaze. "We have a wonderful children's program," the younger one said, reaching into her bag. "Many special little girls like Harriet have found their true purpose with us, their true family." Something about the way she said purpose made my skin crawl. I asked them to leave. That night, I heard voices from Harriet's room. Not children's voices, something else. Something that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. When I burst in, she was alone. But her walls, they were covered in drawings. I've worked in pharmaceutical research. I've seen medical textbooks with detailed surgical procedures. Nothing prepared me for what my 4-year-old had drawn. Women split open from throat to pelvis, their organs replaced with writhing shapes that might have been tentacles or might have been something worse. Faces caught in moments of transformation, skin peeling back to reveal something underneath that didn't follow the rules of anatomy. Not a simple child's doodling, I'm telling you. The drawings grew more detailed every night, more disturbing. She drew them with anything she could find, crayons, markers, her own blood when I took away her art supplies. I'd washed the walls clean before bed only to find them covered again by morning, the images more elaborate, more horrifying. Naked women being penetrated by shadows that seemed to move on the paper. I have no idea how she even knows what sex is. She doesn't watch television, shows little interest in books, doesn't speak with and therefore cannot be influenced by neighborhood kids. I'm not even sure if you could call what she drew sex, to be frank. It came across as more violent. Ritualistic. The changes in Harriet accelerated after that. Her skin began to slough off in patches, revealing something dark and iridescent underneath. Her eyes gradually darkened until they were completely black, and her fingernails turned the color of tar. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of infection, but deep down, I knew better. At the start, I took her to see doctors and specialists, but nothing worked. When they started mentioning prolonged hospitalization and tests, Harriet would act out, violently, both towards me and herself. But at this point, despite spending a lifetime grounded in the exploration of the real, for priding myself in being an individual of sound logic, I knew this was something else. Nothing that medicine could explain. Something other. She stopped sleeping. I'd find her standing in different rooms at night, perfectly still, her head tilted at an angle that made my neck hurt just to look at. Sometimes she'd track movement I couldn't see, her black eyes following invisible things across the ceiling. The houseplants started dying, then the grass in our yard spreading outward from her bedroom window in a perfect circle. I found her in the neighbor's yard one night, crouched over their German shepherd. The dog's chest was torn open, and Harriet's face was buried in the cavity. When she looked up at me, blood dripping from her chin, she spoke for the first time. The sound she made wasn't English, wasn't anything human. It reminded me of the sound oil makes when it hits a hot pan, all sizzle and hiss. But underneath was something else, something that made me taste metal and smell burning hair. I ran inside and vomited until there was nothing left but bile. Forgive me, but I was a mother, and I loved her despite it all. I buried the dog before the sun rose, feigned ignorance when the neighbors came knocking. I found the dog's collar days later, hidden beneath Harriet's pillow like some kind of trophy. She should have been locked up in a psychiatric ward that day, but I was weak, and besides, it wouldn't have worked. Desperate, I began researching the New Eden community. I found an online forum for survivors and connected with a user called the Wicked Below 82. She seemed to know things, horrible things about the community's true purpose, about the 7 compounds spread across North America, Germany, and Australia, about the rooms deep underground where they took the girls who were ready. Her messages became increasingly frantic as we talked. She told me about her time in the compound, about the screams that echoed up from below, about the girls who went down with flat stomachs and came up 9 months later with something moving under their skin. She would have gone herself if she hadn't developed a cancer young that rendered her likely infertile. Thank fuck for osteosarcoma, she joked. Then she asked about Harriet's symptoms, and each answer I gave made her more agitated. You need to end it, she wrote finally, before they complete the circle, before all 7 are born. I can't find her account anymore. I hope nothing has happened to her. But that brings us to tonight. Tonight I woke to a smell like rotting meat. Following it led me to Harriet's room, where I found a pile of what looked like shed snakeskin, but I recognized the birthmark on one piece. The blood trail led to our bathroom where I found her. Jesus, I can barely write it. I can't describe what my daughter had become. What sat in our bathtub looked almost right, but wrong in ways my mind couldn't properly process. Like when you see a face in a dream and know it's your mother, but wake up remembering features that couldn't possibly fit together into a human face. Parts of her seemed to fade in and out of my vision, as if whatever she was becoming couldn't fully exist in our reality. When she moved, her joints bent in directions that made my eyes hurt. Her skin rippled like oil on water, and underneath was something that made me understand why Sylvia went mad. I did what my grandmother had tried to do, what she knew needed to be done. The thing that had been my daughter thrashed and fought, but in the end, I held it under the water. I kept whispering, I'm sorry, even as its claws tore into my arms. Even as I watched my baby girl's face shift between human and monster under the thrashing water. The hardest part wasn't the physical struggle. It was when she stopped fighting. Never call a number scratched into a bathroom stall. The dive bar bathroom smelled like a mix of beer-soaked wood and overused cleaning chemicals that couldn't quite mask the underlying stench. I leaned against the chipped sink, scrolling through my phone, killing time while waiting for my turn to use the stall. That's when I noticed it. It was scratched into the wall beside the mirror in jagged, uneven letters. People Knob, followed by a phone number. The handwriting was chaotic, like it had been carved in a hurry, but the words were oddly precise. I chuckled under my breath. Drunken graffiti was a staple of places like this, but this one had a strange charm. I snapped a picture of it and sent it to the group chat I had with my friends, captioning it, "Found some quality poetry tonight." The replies were instant. What does it even mean? Drunk people are wild. Bet it's a sex line. Call it Peter. I laughed and tucked my phone back in my pocket. Yeah, no thanks. I had no interest in whatever prank or scam waited on the other end of that number. It was probably a hotline for weirdos who got off on creeping out random people. When I finally got home later that night, I looked at the picture again. People knob. What a bizarre phrase. Who even thinks to write something like that? A week later, I saw it again. This time, it was at a trendy cafe downtown. I was washing my hands in their sleek, modern bathroom, the kind with motion sensor everything, when I spotted it etched faintly into the metal edge of the paper towel dispenser. The same sloppy handwriting and the same phone number. I froze, staring at it. The déjà vu hit me hard. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe the same prankster had been here. Maybe it was some urban scavenger hunt or guerrilla marketing campaign. But why people knob? It wasn't clever or catchy. It was just weird. I shook it off and returned to my table, but the encounter stuck with me. Over the next week, I saw the phrase in more places. A park bench near my office, a bus stop on my commute. Once even scratched faintly into the wood of a restaurant booth where I was having dinner with coworkers. The graffiti definitely wasn't confined to seedy places, and it was spreading. At first, I ignored it. That is, until I started to feel like it was following me. 2 weeks after my first encounter, I decided to give in to curiosity. I was at home, scrolling through my photos, when I came across the picture I'd taken in the dive bar. My thumb hovered over the phone number. Rationally, I knew better. Calling random numbers scrawled on bathroom walls wasn't something normal people did, but the sheer repetition of it had me on edge. What was it? A joke? A secret? Or something else entirely? I reasoned with myself that it was probably some bored teenager having fun. I'd call, laugh at the nonsense, and put this whole thing to rest. Before I could second-guess myself, I hit the call button. The line connected, but no one spoke. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then there were sounds. Sloshing, gurgling, wet, visceral noises that made my skin crawl. I blinked, confused. Was it a bad connection? Some kind of strange audio file? I'd hardly had time to consider all the possibilities when, faintly in the background, I heard what sounded like muffled screaming. My stomach turned. I gripped the phone tighter, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The sounds weren't static. They were deliberate and organic. Whatever was happening on the other end of the line was deeply wrong, and sounded very, very real. "Hello?" I said, my voice cracking slightly. No answer. Just the wet, squelching noises and tortured screams. I hung up, my heart racing. For a few minutes, I just sat there staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. Maybe it was a prank, some kind of sick joke. But the screams, they sounded genuine. I tried not to think about it. I shoved my phone into my pocket, turned on the TV, and drowned the memory in sitcom reruns. I barely had time to relax when my phone buzzed and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I peered at my screen and swallowed hard. I gasped when I realized it was the same number, the one I had just called, and it was calling me back. Against my better judgment, I answered, my hands trembling slightly. The same noises poured into my ear, slurping and squelching, and now, accompanying it, a bizarre mechanical whirring. It sounded something like a grinder or a machine chewing through something. Beyond the din, I heard more screaming, this time louder and more desperate. "Who is this?" I shouted, panic overtaking me. I received no response, but it was clear now that someone on the other line was listening. I could hear them breathing, heavy, labored inhalations that filled the silence between the grotesque sounds. I couldn't take it anymore. "I'm calling the police, you sick freak," I yelled, smashing the end call button. I blocked the number and tossed the phone onto the couch. That night, for the first time in years, I double-checked that all my doors and windows were locked. I didn't sleep. Even after making sure that the locks on my doors and windows were functional, I didn't feel safe. Instead, I felt like I was being watched. I had no reason to believe that the owner of the number knew where I lived, and yet I couldn't relax. The call had rattled me more than I wanted to admit. Those sounds, wet, organic, and punctuated by screaming, played on repeat in my mind. I told myself again it was a harmless prank meant to freak me out, but my gut told me otherwise. The next morning, still groggy from lack of sleep, I decided to report the calls. It felt ridiculous walking into the police station to explain what had happened, but it seemed like the right thing to do under the circumstances. I'd spent the drive there rehearsing what I'd say, trying to make it sound as normal as possible. The desk officer looked unimpressed as I laid it all out. "You called a number scratched on a bathroom wall and they made noises at you?" He quirked an eyebrow. I cleared my throat. It wasn't just noises. It sounded like someone was screaming, and there was this machine sound. It wasn't normal. The officer leaned back in his chair, stifling a yawn. "Look, unless they threatened you or you've got proof of a crime, there's not much we can do. Probably just some pervert having a laugh. Block the number and move on." I felt a spark of irritation flare. "So, if this person is hurting someone, like the screaming I heard, you're just going to ignore it?" He gave me a look that said he was done humoring me. "We get weird calls reported all the time. If it happens again, record it and bring that in. But for now, I suggest you let it go." I walked out of the station, fuming. Let it go? Sure, I'd just forget the horrifying sounds and the way my stomach dropped when the number called back. The cops clearly weren't going to help. That night, my friends and I decided to hit up a new bar downtown. I figured a few drinks and some good company would be enough to distract me from the unsettling events of the past few days. By the time we arrived, I was already a couple of beers in, feeling the edge of my anxiety dull. The place was crowded and lively, with dim lighting and music loud enough to vibrate the walls. My friends and I grabbed a corner booth, ordering drinks and shouting over the noise to catch up on everyone's week. "Still freaked out about that creepy phone call?" my friend Kyle asked, leaning across the table. I shrugged, not wanting to get into it. "Blocked the number, haven't heard anything since." "See?" he said with a grin. "Problem solved. You just gotta quit being such a magnet for weird stuff." I forced a laugh, but my unease lingered. After a while, the drinks caught up to me, and I excused myself to find the bathroom. The hallway leading there was narrow and lined with framed vintage posters. The bathroom itself was what you'd expect. Grimy tile, flickering fluorescent lights, and a stall door that didn't quite close all the way. I stepped into the stall and sighed, leaning against the wall as I did my business. That's when I heard it. Someone entered the stall next to mine, their footsteps heavy. There was something unusual about the way they moved, accompanied by a dragging sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then came the noises, wet, slurping sounds, like someone sucking the marrow from a bone. My chest tightened as I recognized the sounds from the phone calls. What were the odds? I froze, straining to hear. I had to be sure. As I listened, the noises grew louder and more grotesque. A faint, rhythmic gulping, like something viscous being stirred and then swallowed. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced with panic, screaming at me to get out. I zipped up and stumbled out of the stall, barely registering the flickering lights overhead. I burst back into the main bar area, overwhelmed by the urge to flee the building. I didn't care if I sounded insane. "Guys," I said, grabbing Kyle's arm. "Someone's in the bathroom. It's the same thing from the calls." My friends exchanged glances, clearly skeptical. "What are you talking about?" Kyle asked, frowning. "I'm not joking," I hissed. Just come look." They followed me, laughing nervously as we made our way back to the bathroom. I pushed open the door, fully expecting to see someone, or something, waiting inside. It was empty. The bathroom was empty. There were no dragging footsteps and no wet noises, just the faint hum of flickering fluorescent lights, and me, looking like an absolute fool. My friends groaned in frustration. "Dude, you've had way too much to drink," Kyle said, shaking his head. "Wait," I said, pointing to the stall I'd been in. The words "People Knob" were freshly etched into the metal door, the jagged letters standing out starkly against the smoothly polished surface. "What the hell?" one of my friends muttered, leaning in for a closer look. Kyle snorted. "So someone's been tagging bathrooms. Big deal." "It wasn't here when I walked in," I snapped, my voice rising. I swear to God something's going on. Kyle rolled his eyes. Fine. Let's see how funny this pervert thinks they are. He whipped out his phone and dialed the number before I could stop him. No, what are you doing, Kyle? I shouted. Are you crazy? I grabbed for his phone, but he held it out of reach. You don't get it. Now they'll have your number too. Kyle laughed. Relax, man. They're probably some loser living in their mom's basement. I'll give him a piece of my mind. He held the phone to his ear. A moment later, we heard the line connect, and then his grin faded. His expression shifted from amused to confused, then to something else entirely. Fear. What is it, Kyle? I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. His voice was barely a whisper. They want to talk to you, Peter. I didn't speak to Kyle for the rest of the night. I barely even said goodbye to my friends as I bolted out of the bar. The words, "They want to talk to you," played on a loop in my head, growing louder with each repetition until I felt like my skull would split. The streets blurred past me as I power walked toward home, sweat slicking my palms. The city lights offered no comfort. Each shadow, every passing stranger felt sinister. When I reached my apartment building, I froze at the sight of my door. It was ajar. I stood there for a moment, rooted in place. Had I forgotten to lock it? No. I remembered doing it before I left. My gut twisted as I opened the door, wincing at the creak of the hinges. The living room looked normal. Too normal. My laptop was still on the coffee table, the half-empty bag of chips from earlier in the day untouched. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet the air felt heavy. Grabbing the largest kitchen knife I owned, I began a slow, deliberate sweep of the apartment. My breath caught in my throat as I checked the closets, under the bed, and behind the shower curtain. Everything was as it should be. Everything, that is, except the bathroom. When I turned the light on, I nearly dropped the knife. There it was. People knob, scratched into the tile above the sink, the same message that had haunted me for days. The jagged letters glared back at me, meticulously scrawled in identical handwriting. I stumbled back. This wasn't just a prank. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I didn't waste another second. I bolted out of the building, knife still in hand, and called my best friend Jake, begging to crash on his couch for the night. Jake didn't ask many questions. He'd always been the kind of guy who didn't pry, which was one of the reasons I trusted him. I gave him the short version. Someone had broken into my apartment and left a creepy message. He nodded grimly, offering me a blanket and a beer. The next morning, after calling my landlord and leaving them a voicemail explaining why I was leaving, I packed a bag and drove to my parents' house. I couldn't face going back to the apartment. Not yet. My mom fussed over me the way she always did, offering coffee and concerned questions. My dad was quieter, his frown deep and contemplative as I explained the situation. "This some kind of stalker, you think?" he asked finally. "I don't know," I replied. "The police didn't take it seriously the first time, and now..." I trailed off, unsure of how to explain the gravity of what had happened. My parents did their best to make me feel secure. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. The isolation of the house, the way it sat back from the road, surrounded by tall trees, felt like a buffer between me and whatever was happening. By the second night, I even managed to sleep. The illusion of safety didn't last. It was my mom's cell phone that rang first. We were sitting in the kitchen, sipping coffee and talking about mundane things, when she picked it up. Her face clouded with confusion as she looked at the screen. "It's for you," she said, holding the phone out to me. I stared at her, my blood turning to ice. "What do you mean it's for me?" "I don't know," she said, frowning. "I just feel like it's meant for you." My hands shook as I took the phone from her. "Hello?" The line was silent for a moment. Then the familiar noises began. Slurping, squelching, and the faint hum of a machine grinding in the background. Farther back, quiet but still audible, were the muffled screams. I hung up immediately, my chest heaving. The phone dropped from my hand onto the kitchen table. "What is it?" my mom asked, alarmed. "It's them," I whispered. They followed me here." After that, I knew I couldn't stay at my parents' house any longer. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop. It didn't matter where I went. And the last thing I wanted was for my parents to get involved, or worse, hurt. My landlord called me back the next day, promising to change the locks and install security cameras. The police assured me they'd patrol the area. Reluctantly, I agreed to return to the apartment. When I arrived, the building seemed quieter than usual. My neighbors' doors were all shut tight, and the hallways were silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. I unlocked the door, half expecting the graffiti to still be on the bathroom wall, but everything looked pristine. The landlord had done a thorough job cleaning up. I spotted several new cameras on the way in. Everything looked good so far. I let out a shaky breath and dropped my bag onto the couch. For the first time in days, I felt a sliver of hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe I could start piecing my life back together. Then I noticed a voicemail notification on my phone. It was from my landlord, time-stamped about 30 minutes before I arrived. Somehow I had missed it. I pressed play, holding the phone to my ear. "Peter, it's Jim," the message began, his voice trembling. "Listen, I was reviewing the security footage from the night of the break-in and, look, I don't know how to say this, but whatever went into your apartment that night, it never left. It's still in there. I'm on my way with the police. Don't go inside. Whatever you do, don't..." The message cut off. I stood there, frozen. Jim's message hadn't even had time to register yet by the time a sound reached me from the bedroom. It was faint at first, but as I listened, it grew louder. A wet, scraping noise, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of heavy footsteps. They were getting closer. I didn't even grab my bag. I bolted out the door and sprinted down the street. I didn't stop running until I was blocks away and my legs gave out. My lungs felt as if they were on fire by the time I collapsed on a bench near a 24-hour diner. I gulped down air, glancing over my shoulder like a hunted animal. Every shadow on the sidewalk, every car passing by, felt like a threat. Jim's voicemail replayed in my mind, his panicked words echoing over the sound of those dragging footsteps. Whatever went into my apartment that night, it never left. I never went back to my apartment again. By the time my landlord and the police arrived, I was already gone, sitting in Jake's living room, shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. Jake didn't interrupt, and for once, he didn't even crack a joke. When I finished, he sat in stunned silence. "Man, you're not going back there, are you?" he finally asked. I shook my head vehemently. "Number, I'm done. I'm not going back. Not when it knows where I live." And I meant it. Whatever I left behind, clothes, furniture, even my laptop, it wasn't worth my trouble or my life. Jake offered to let me crash at his place for a while, but I knew that wasn't an option. I didn't want whatever it was to follow me there, too. I spent the next week at a cheap motel on the edge of town, paying in cash and keeping my phone turned off, except to check for updates from the landlord and the cops. Each night, I triple-checked the locks on the door and windows, slept with the lights on, and tucked a knife under my pillow. The landlord called twice. The first time, he left a voicemail saying the apartment was empty when they arrived. According to him, there was no sign of forced entry. No signs of anyone or anything inside. I couldn't help but scoff. The second time, he didn't leave a message. I left town the following weekend. I packed what little I could fit into my car and drove until the city was a distant memory. I settled in a small town a few states away, a quiet place where nobody knew my name. I found a job at a local hardware store and rented a modest room above an elderly couple's garage. For a while, I began to believe I could move on. Unfortunately, as it turns out, the damage was already done. I still see it sometimes. Not the thing itself, thank God, but the aftermath. Little signs that remind me that it's still out there. A phrase scrawled on a wall in an unfamiliar handwriting. A phone number scratched into the edge of a table at a diner. Once, I swore I caught a glimpse of the words "people knob" on a sticky note stuck to the inside of a bus shelter. I never take the bus anymore. Perhaps I'm just lucky, but the calls have stopped. I changed my number, disconnected my old phone, and started over with a new device. And so far, I've managed to avoid any strange voicemails or late-night calls. The fear, however, still lingers. The nightmares are the worst. In them, I'm back in my old apartment. The walls are covered in the words "people knob," carved so deeply that the plaster is flaking off. Wet, gurgling sounds fill the air, punctuated by agonized screams that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In the dream, I know I should run, but my legs refuse to move. Something approaches me, its footsteps slow and deliberate, dragging heavily across the floor. I always wake up before I see it. I don't talk about it much anymore. Jake's the only person who knows the full story, and even he avoids bringing it up. It's easier that way, pretending like it never happened. But sometimes, when I see jagged handwriting etched into a random bathroom stall or a graffiti-covered wall, I wonder how many other people have called the number, that number. And I wonder, how many others got out alive?